I'm just on week 3 of the book tour for Herding Donkeys, so just still getting the hang of this a bit. But I thought I would just talk a little bit about the book and then sort of explain why I asked Marshall to come, and then we're going to kind of just talk a little bit and then sort of open it up. We can talk about the political situation today, but I guess I would just want to talk a little bit about the book and what it's about. And it really tells the story of the evolution of American politics from Howard Dean to Barack Obama. And the reason I chose that period of time is because after the election, I was really struck by, and during the election, I was really struck by the grassroots political movement that, in my opinion, really defined the Obama campaign, in which Marshall and I will talk a lot about tonight. And I thought that, there was all these books I knew that were going to be written about Obama, but I felt like they were really going to talk about either the man himself and his unique characteristics, or they were going to talk a lot about the inner circle and the genius of David Plouffe and David Axelrod. And I thought that was all well and good, but that was missing a very important story, which was the story of the organizers and activists who I really thought defined the campaign. It really built the campaign and shaped it in their own image. And I really thought that if you look back on politics, that a lot of that stuff really began with Howard Dean's campaign for president in 2003. Because, whether you like Dean or not, his campaign ended up looking radically different than the Gore campaign or the Bush campaign. So he was onto something in terms of a new model of politics. And the thing was, Dean, when he ran for president, really had no idea what he was doing. He was running as he was governor of Vermont for 5 terms, but he was a pretty conventional guy and didn't really want to talk about a balanced budget and health care. But I mean, the war in Iraq, it was exploding, and Dean started talking about the war and thinking this kind of a crazy idea, and started, opposing the war, and in these gatherings of Democrats, and realized, I'm on to something. A lot of Democrats were like right on, even though the political calculus at the time said there was no way you could oppose the war, and that really differentiated himself, from John Kerry and John Edwards and Joe Lieberman and all the front runners for the nomination. And once Dean started speaking out against the war, and I mean, this was pre-YouTube, so it took a little while for speeches to circulate, but he gave this very famous speech at the Democratic National Committee meeting in 2003 in Washington. It was a cattle call with all the presidential candidates, and Dean, I'm sure some of you know this, but Dean sort of famously came up and he said, what I want to know is why so many Democrats are supporting the president's unilateral intervention in Iraq. And then he said the same thing about the Bush tax cuts and No Child Left Behind, and then he ended by lifting a line, I think unconsciously at that point, from the late Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone. He said, I'm Howard Dean, and I'm here to represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And, the room, which had been pretty shocked up to that point, which these are very sterile, backslapping affairs, the room really erupted. And Democrats started to rally around this message. And once he got the people inspired, which we'll talk about again, like Obama inspired them, all of a sudden this incredible amount of innovation starts happening in his campaign. That he has this kind of mad genius campaign manager, Joe Trippi, and Trippi wants to unleash the internet as a way to organize people, and no one had really done that before, and so all of a sudden a lot of money starts pouring in online. The barriers for entry start getting lower and lowered, and I think the Dean campaign becomes very innovative, and not just online, and Marshall will talk about this, but also resurrecting old school organizing and making some of those people relevant again. And the Obama campaign becomes this amazing blend of those two worlds, these organizers and then online and offline, as they say in the political business. And so, whatever, Dean flames out. He has all this innovation, but he can never really figure out how to channel it effectively. His campaign flames out. Everyone knows what happens next, the scream, et cetera, et cetera. His political obituary. I mean, it's amazing. This guy, his campaign comes out of nowhere. It goes from 0 to 60. One thing happens in Iowa, and he's back to 0. Practically overnight. I mean, it's kind of shocking. And then a lot of people just sort of write him off. One Republican media strategist says, he'll melt and melt and melt until there is no more Howard Dean. And I think, that was pretty much the conventional wisdom in Washington, that this guy was done. And then a year later, he's back as chair of the Democratic Party. People are like, wait, what happened? I thought this guy was done. And so, to me, that was like a fascinating, I've been interested in the Dean campaign from the very beginning, but to me that was just like a fascinating political story. Like, how did this guy get back? And he got back because, he had built a network among sort of rank-and-file political activists that felt left out of the traditional political process. And some of those people happened to be members of, the Democratic National Committee, which you'd think would be the ultimate, insider group. But turned out they kind of wanted to fight the establishment too. So, Dean comes back and does this thing, this 50-state strategy, which is he's trying to rebuild local Democratic parties across the country. And so this is all just a basis of the fact that, when Obama comes along, I saw a lot of parallels between how the Obama people were building on what Dean was trying to do at the same point that I felt like a lot of the Clinton people were kind of ignoring it. I think if you look at the 2008 presidential primary, it's very much become sort of a battle of old and new politics. And Obama figures out how to fuse the old with the new, where Clinton just sort of, ignores the new, I think, to her own peril, it turns out. And same with sort of John McCain. And then, so that was really the story I wanted to tell, and that's what I wrote in my proposal after the election. Of course, now things have become, significantly more complicated. I mean, the question that I was looking at after the election was what's going to become of this movement, and Marshall and I will talk about this. I didn't foresee, I don't think anyone foresaw the rise of the Tea Party, and the political situation now is very much in flux. But, in the book, I tried to offer the perspective of these organizers and these activists. And one of the key people that I talk about in the book is Marshall.